Hello everyone. In this video we are going to talk about functions and the default arguments. So here I included the CMath library because I want to use the power function and the square root function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you two different types of functions that we have. The type of function that returns some value for you. The main function is one of them that we have used so far. It always returns a 0 if it's running successfully, and not 0, of course, if it fails. And then there are some functions that do not return anything, and we call them void. So we define them as void, and we say this function is void, which means it doesn't return anything. It does something, but doesn't return a value. So what do we have here? So the function that returns something, the type of the value it returns, we define it right before the name of the function. So we say this function returns double values, give it a name, and then in parentheses you define the arguments for it and declare them. So you have to give the type of the variables right there as well. So say, hey, this function takes 3 arguments in general, x, y, and n, and they're all double. And here, this parameter n, you give it a value yourself. Instead of waiting for the user to give you a value, you pass a value to it here. We call this type of input value or input argument, we call it the default. And what is that? It means if the user provides a number for n, and that n is anything other than 2, then n will be overwritten. Right? So if I give 3, then n will be 3. But if I don't give a number for n, then the program has n of 2 to use. Okay? So if a parameter, the value for it is provided, an input for the function, that value can be given by the user or can be skipped, and we call it what? The default parameter. So what does this function do? It is going to square x, it is going to square y, and then it's going to return 1 over n, which is basically the nth root of x squared plus y squared, and n by default is 2, so it's going to return basically the Euclidean norm, right? But in general, somebody might use something else, but that's not right for hypotenuse, because the goal of this function is to return the size of hypotenuse of basically a right triangle. So really all of these numbers should be 2. But here I'm just showing you as an option, can I use a number other than 2? Yes, of course it's not really right to use any number other than 2. I'm just trying to show you what a default parameter would look like. I also have a utility function here for this function at the bottom. So let me first talk about this function at the bottom, and then I go back to the utility function for it. So this function here, num is prime. It accepts a number in integer format of z, and it doesn't return anything. It just shows a message on the screen. What does it do? It checks whether that number is a prime number or not. How does it do it? First, it defines a Boolean value flag of true, and then for all integer numbers from 2 all the way to less than or equal square root of z, it checks the remainder of division of z by those numbers. If that division is 0, means z can be divided by that ii, then the number is not prime, so I turn my flag to false. So flag of false means the number is not prime, flag of true means the number is prime. And then based on the flag, I decide what to show. So if flag, which means if flag is 1, then I say number is prime. If not flag, of course, else, I say the number is what? Not prime. So you see this function does not return a number for me. It's just going to show one of these two messages. Okay, so we call this function void. Now, this function, instead of using the default square root function that you have in standard or in CMath library, this function is going to use a utility function called my_squared, which is the same as the square root. Okay, it's the same as the square root, but basically what it does is I want to show you how to use a utility function. So if you want, in this case, you can use the basic square root function, but I want to show you if a function has to use another function as what we call a utility function, how can it do that? So here, this function is calling the my square root to give the value back, to give this value back to it. So what does this one do? It receives a number z, which in general could be double in general. Right now, for my case, my number is integer, but it can be even what? It can be even double. So what happens here? I'm passing it an integer, but it expects a double, so it converts my x into double here. And then it has this default parameter of n equal 2, and all you see it returns is the square root, right? It's power of x and 1 over 2, which is the square root. And I'm not passing any number n here other than what? Other than 2. If I pass 3, then I'm going to ruin the square root. If I have to pass, I have to pass 2, and since it has 2 already, I'm not going to pass it, so I leave it as a default argument. So here, this my square root is a utility function for this. This is going to call that every time in this for loop to give the value back to it, and then it is going to tell you whether the number is what? Prime or not. So I have three functions: an independent function returning a number, a utility function returning a number, and a void function that does not return any number. And I'm going to use all of these guys in my main function. So here in my main, I define two doubles, x and y, and an integer z. First, I ask for the user to give me x and y, which are the two sides of a right triangle separated by a white space. I get them both in. And then to show them the size of the hypotenuse, I call my hypotenuse function, and that returns the number for me. Then I ask the user to provide a positive integer number. I get it, and then I call my function num is prime to say whether that number was prime number or whether that number was not a prime number. So look here, main function calls is prime number, num is prime, and num is prime calls which function? It calls my square root. So you see there is a hierarchy. Main calls num is prime calling what? My square root. So there are two levels of utility functions here. And the most important thing about utility functions is this. If a function has to use another one as a utility, you have to define the utility ahead of the main function, ahead of the using function. So here my main is using what? Is using num is prime and is using hypotenuse. In order for main to be able to use these two, where do I define them? I define both of them what? Above the main function, as you can see, before I even start the main function. And here, look, num is prime is using my square root. Where do I define my square root? Above the num is prime. If I go ahead and bring this function definition and bring this guy what? Instead of above it, if I bring it down here below num is prime and run, you're going to get an error. Let me show you. So first here, I leave it as is and I run. So you see the result. It says, give me the two sides of a right triangle. So here 3 space 4, right? The hypotenuse is 5, and then give it a number, let's say 7. Then it says, well, 7 is a prime number, and we can check it for another set. So let's say here, we say, for example, 6 and 8, and it gives you 10, and then this time I say what? Like 35, right? And 35 is not a prime number. So you see the code is working, right? Now, as I said, if I bring this utility function, look, if I bring this and paste it here, below the function that is using it, which is num is prime, look what happens. You see, it says, hey, my square root that you called here is not declared. Why? Because it's declared afterwards. You cannot declare it afterwards. You have to declare it beforehand, up here. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so I assume you learned how to write a function, and there are two types of functions. You learn about default argument and you learn about utility functions and where to put them. So hopefully this video was useful to you. I'll see you in the next lecture.